Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to have our esteemed speaker to speak on budgets and reserves today. We have Matt Queasley, and this will be 2 IFM CEU credits for CAMs that are on today. So those are kind of valuable credits, I know for myself as well. My name is Peggy West. I'm the organizer. And I just have a couple of things to say before we do get started. I know that budget season is around the corner, so I want to ask you to please consider anyone that's on today as a sponsor to give them consideration if you're looking for a vendor in that category. Yes, it is 2 CEU credits today, so CAMs, please allow 2 to 3 weeks for your credit to be posted. We are going to have over 200 or 300 on today. Right now, we already have signed in 223, so it takes a little bit of time to post those with the DBPR. One thing is to put your questions, please, in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Please just Q&A. We are recording those questions. And because we have such amount of educational material to present today, we may not be able to answer all the questions. So please put your name after the question. And that way, when they're recorded, if Matt doesn't get to them today, he can send you a follow-up email with the answers. If you have a comment to make, sponsors included, if you want to put your information in the chat box for everyone to see. But you will be getting a sponsor sheet following the class, and it will have everyone's contact information on it. I do want to thank everyone, board members and CAMs, for choosing our webinar today. We know you have other choices. I'm continually impressed by the voluntary board members who take this seriously and get all the information and the knowledge that you can to work harmoniously with your managers. The more you know and the more the managers know, of course, it helps you follow the laws, stay in compliance, and it also is good for your community. Okay, today after the class, I'll also be sending out the recording, and Matt's allowing us to send out the slides with that sponsorship. So that will be within hopefully 1 or 2 days following today's webinar. Let's get started introducing the sponsors. First, I want to thank and introduce Vinteum Software. It's Julia Alvarez on today. She is the marketing representative. Julia, tell us about yourself and the company, please.
Yes, of course, Peggy. Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I'm Julia, as Peggy said, the marketing specialist, the international representative here at Vinteum. And here at Vinteum, we know how complex community management can be. So that's why we created Neigbrs by Vinteum over 10 years ago. It's an all-in-one app and portal that helps board members streamline operations from your community finances to amenity reservations, even with a multi-channel communication tool. We have a lot of tools. So even if you want to be compliant with laws such as the Florida website law, we offer, Neighbor offers a community website with a resident portal protected by password. So that's it. Imagine updating residents across SMS, email, smart calls, even during emergencies. It's awesome. So if that sounds like something your community could benefit from, I would drop the link in the chat so you can schedule a free, no strings attached demo, okay? It's Neighbors in action, and I hope we all have a great webinar today. Thank you, Peggy.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for all you do. I really appreciate it. All right, next, I want to go on and jump ahead here and introduce Diana Alert. She's with Best Roofing. She's a senior marketing business developer. Diana, I know you have a meeting to run to, so please tell us about yourself and the company. What are you guys doing these days?
Thank you so much, Peggy. So for you that don't know, Best Roofing has been in business for 47 years this year. We cover Palm Beach, Broward, and Dade, and we're doing absolutely everything. We didn't used to do residential, now we do. So if you have any needs on your residence as well, we can help you have the commercial part. We can also do high rises, apartment buildings. We do commercial, absolutely everything, government, everything. So if you need some input from an expert, please contact me. I will be more than happy to help you, give you a pre-roof estimate, figure out what is wrong, and find an answer and help you throughout the process.
That
Thank you.
sounds good. Are you servicing all of Florida or South Florida? What's your area? I forgot.
We're servicing right now West Palm Beach, Broward, and Dade, but we're opening a little bit on north now. We'll be working around Tampa area soon. So we're working on that, but I don't want to promise anything because it should be around like a month and a half that we can actually start operating over there.
Okay, great. All right, good to know. All right, well, thank you and good luck with your meeting. Next,
Thank
I
you,
want to,
Peggy.
you're welcome. I want to introduce Daniel Baum. He's the founder and CEO of COA Solutions of Florida, and he is today's moderator. Daniel, tell us about yourself and what you do.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Daniel Baum. I am a commercial property and casualty insurance specialist. My job is to help you and your community save money on your insurance while not reducing coverage, making sure we have proper coverage, but at the lowest possible price. It's been a pretty wild year this year for insurance. Premiums on property came down significantly over the last 6 months. Hopefully you're all seeing that in the premiums on your renewals. Don't look now, but we are just a few days from the official hurricane season as far as the insurance companies are concerned. And things might change drastically once we cross over June 1. You'll also probably saw that directors and officers went up this year. General liability may have gone up this year. That's got to do a lot with the fraud that went on some of the boards that I'm sure you've all been reading about. So my point is simply that the insurance market is constantly changing. It's something you should be paying attention to and reading about continuously. If you're getting my emails, hopefully you're reading the articles I send out. If you're not seeing reductions this year, or you're questioning whether or not you have the right coverage or your agent is working hard on your behalf, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to do a free review of your policies. No strings attached. I'll let you know my thoughts and you can take it from there. Thank you again for joining us. Wish you the best and hope you enjoy the webinar. Back to you, Peggy.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, next I want to introduce Brooke Cavender. She's with Southwest Elevator Company. Welcome, Brooke. It's been a while, and tell us about yourself and your company.
Thanks, Peggy. Yes, my name's Brooke. I am with Southwest Elevator. We are a full service elevator shop. We are a union company, and we are family owned and operated. So I'm actually the 4th generation stepping in. We provide maintenance, repair, modernization. So really anything you would need for elevators. We have a headquarters in Dallas, but currently here in Florida, I'm sitting in our Fort Lauderdale office, which covers all of South Florida. We go over to Naples, and then we just expanded to Orlando and Daytona Beach. So anything you would possibly need, if you're in need of a quote or a second opinion, we are here to help, and I will drop my information in the chat box. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us. Okay, next I want to introduce Mustafa Adib. He is the project manager for PD Concrete. Looks like you're on the job there. What's going on?
Hey, good morning, Peggy. Good afternoon. My name is Mustafa Adib. I'm the project manager with PD Concrete Specialist. We are specialized in concrete restoration, as you can see, post-tension cable repairs, waterproofing, and painting. We've been in business for over 21 years, been operating from our 2 locations, one in West Palm Beach and Ventura. One thing I always mention it is to achieve a good quality in work and safety. We are proud to have our in-house crew. We don't rely on subcontractors, and we have a really good or high performance bond capacity. So we can just take over any job, no matter how big is it. So I'll be happy to help you and do a free walkthrough for your building to achieve 40, 50, or 60 recertificate. And I'll leave my information in the chat box. Please reach out to me if you have any question. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm going to say honorable mention here because he's hiding here, but Daniel Pena is the president. He is on today. I want to thank Daniel and your entire team for joining many of my webinars. Next, I want to introduce gentleman Ben Friedman. He is our president of the City Quiet Company. And I don't see him on today, so he must have an extended vacation. But I do want to say thank you to him for his continued sponsorship and reach out to him for windows and doors. We're coming into hurricane season, so check your budget, get ready for your budget, because the next one I want to introduce is Jamie Gelfand. She's with First Citizens Bank. They offer loans for all types. They're getting ready again, like they said, for hurricane season, and they also can set up a nice rate for you. Right now, they have some rates going on that are better than some of the other banks that are out there. So if you need a new account or a new bank, please reach out to Jamie Gelfand. She'll be on the sponsor sheet. Next, I want to introduce Ashley Leonardo. She's with Munyon Painting and Contracting out of Tampa area. Tell us about yourself and the other areas you cover.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. So I'm gonna give my little spiel. So for those of you who don't know us, we're Florida's top choice painting contractor, and we handle all apartment, condo, HOA, commercial, residential, exterior, interior painting. Munyon's got you covered. You know, we'll do railings, doors, sidewalks, driveways. We'll do it all. So we have been in business for over 74 years, since 1951, and we do cover the entire state of Florida. So north to south, you know, that we have offices over in West Palm, which is where Shelly is. I'm over here in our Tampa office, over in Largo, kind of beneath the Tampa Bay area. And in our office over here, we actually have a color and design studio where we've gotten a bunch of suppliers that we work with, Sherwin, Behr, Spectrum, Florida Paint, stuff like that, to set up a showroom for any board members and managers in the area. So we do color consultations if you are local to this area. And we also have rooms available for board meetings. So I know sometimes I'll see some board meetings happening at Panera Bread, and we wanted to kind of open our doors in our office spaces to allow anyone to have their meetings here and kind of utilize the space. So we also have a client care center on our website. So you don't have to be local for that one. Any job sites we have with you guys, you can go in, access live updates, photos, any residents, board members, anybody kind of wanting additional information, you can just log in on there and check it all out. So if anyone has any painting needs, contracting, stuff like that, my info is in the chat, so don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you guys.
Hey, thank you so much, and thanks for sponsoring again.
Wow.
Next, I want to introduce live Bob Aleka. Bob, tell us about Faster.io, what you're doing, and the future for Faster.
Well, thanks, Peggy. Good afternoon, everybody. Bob Aleka here with Faster.io. Faster.io has been building, managing, and maintaining fiber optic infrastructures for over 20 years. We provide most of the infrastructures for most of the telecom providers here in Florida. So if you're in a situation where you're looking to get a new provider, one of the best things we do is we're backed up by our data center. So which means that you're going to come directly from our data center to your building, right? Fiber optics right into your unit. All our speeds are symmetrical. So whatever you get down, you get up. We don't have a limit on speeds. It's just a matter of what the association would like. Our streaming TV you take with you. You can change your address and your locals will follow you. We also provide a VPN for everybody, a virtual private network, which allows the resident for more security, as well as if the resident does not live in the States and they live outside the States, they can stream the TV outside the States through the VPN. So if you're a small condominium, whether you're 15 or 20 units or 1,000 units, we do it all. If you're in a bulk situation now and it's coming due within the next 2 years or less, or if you're in a retail situation, you think of going bulk, give me a shout and we can see what we can do for you guys. So I'll leave my information in the chat and enjoy the webinar. Thanks, Peggy.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, and I want to make honorable mention of his partner, Vice President of Marketing, Michael Zirin. Together, they will reach out to you at any time, and they can put together some really dynamic meetings. So good time to reach out to them because we're going into budget season. Next, I have the next two sponsors, not present, but the Paving Lady, a very reputable company, been around for over 25 years now as the Paving Lady. The owner has over 35 years of experience, Mauro Camuzzi. Their representative is Dawn Miller, who will be on the sponsor sheet. If you need anything in that area, please give them a call. Lastly, I want to mention Hafer Company. They're a CPA service. They do full service, including auditing, managing your bookkeeping or your payments for maintenance. They have 4 offices around the state, very well known and very esteemed. So please reach out to Nicole Johnson or her partner, Mark Landez. Okay, so now I'm proud to turn this over to Daniel Baum, who will introduce our presenter today, Matt Queasley. Daniel, take it away.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Just give me 1 second, if you would. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again. I'd like to present to you Matthew Queasley, otherwise known as Matt, Director and Shareholder of Reserve Advisors. Matt is responsible for the overall management and administration of the firm's Southeast Regional team. For those of you who don't know Reserve Advisors, they're the leading provider of reserve study consulting services, having conducted reserve studies for more than 30,000 communities. Matt is a professional engineer licensed in Florida since 2006 and also holds both the Reserve Specialist and Professional Reserve Analyst designations. He's also the treasurer of his own condominium in Tampa, where he has served on the board for the last 15 years. So not only giving you advice, but implementing them himself. Finally, Matt is a frequent speaker and author and a Florida licensed continuing education provider for Community Association Managers. He serves on the CAI National Business Partner Council, the CAI National Board of Trustees, and as a council member with the Florida Legislative Alliance. So we couldn't be more happy to have Matt speaking on this subject today. Before I turn it over to him, one last reminder, everyone, we have almost 300 people on this webinar. It's very difficult to try to keep track of what's going on in the chat. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I'm going to pause Matt periodically to answer questions, but he does have a fairly extensive presentation. I'd like him to be able to get to all of it for your benefit. So as Peggy said, if we don't make it to your question, we'll do our best to try to answer them at the end, or see if Matt can't do it after the webinar. With that, thank you very much, Matt. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I am excited to be here. Can you guys hear and see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see you just fine.
Perfect. So this is, as Peggy mentioned, a 2-hour course on one of the most exciting topics in my mind, of course, budgeting and reserves. We're going to have stuff for homeowners associations, condo associations, co-ops even, and just a whole bunch of things on the structural integrity reserve study and the new requirements out there. This course and the slides have been around for a couple of years now. They've been updated. We updated them last year. They have not been updated for the new bill, House Bill 913, but we will cover on that. I know there'll be a lot of questions about that. That is for those that are not following around. It's another large condominium piece of legislation that passed the House and the Senate in late last month, I think on the 30th of April, and is not yet gone to the governor, but will be. He's indicated he likely will sign that bill. It'll become effective July 1st, so coming up in another 5-6 weeks. So we'll cover some of that new stuff, but a lot of this is best practices that I've picked up over 25 years as a reserve provider and 15 years as a board member, and of course working with the legislature and the Department of Business and Professional Regulation in our state about what to do with all the budget questions, reserves, etc. Don't want to be Debbie Downer here, but we are at the end of May, which means June and July are right around the corner, and that usually kicks off the budget season. So the budget season is a long season, and it seems to start early. And especially this year, more of the managers I'm talking with and board members want to get started early on the budget season. One of the most important parts of your budget we're going to talk about many times today is just transparency and communication with your ownership. And starting early is always better than waiting till the last moment. And one other note, I think this is the last slide I have with the little QR code on it. The slides can be downloaded there, but as Peggy said, I'll send them to her as well, and she can transmit them out to you folks as well. And for the CAMs in there, just make sure Peggy has your CAM number. She's going to send that. I think that's part of the registration. So we'll get all of those entered in, try to get that in here in the next week or so. But sometimes it does take a while with a large group. So thank you for that. And welcome to budget season. But what is a budget at a very high level? Of course, I know we probably have some new board members on here. I mean, it's a plan that outlines the expenses and the income of the association. It's the basis for which our assessments are calculated, and it's a benchmark to monitor the association's finances. It's one of the biggest roles that the board of directors has is to put together the budgets. Often the treasurer falls on the treasurer to kind of take the lead on that and take the charge on that. But it is an extremely important process, which is, again, is why it's beneficial to start early. The budget typically accounts to two main portions of their budget. From expense portion, that's going to be the operating budget and the reserve budget. So the operating budget, just as at a high level, again, whether you're condo, co-op, HOA, the operating budget would be your annual expenses associated with day-to-day operations. It's not necessarily the big things that happen less frequently than annually. Those are reserves. So these types of expenses would be administration, management, maintenance, taxes, insurance, security fees, etc. Again, things that are happening throughout the year and year over year, planned expenses that you would have in your operating budget. Some tips: establish a budget committee, and I'll just give a quick story. When I first bought my very first home, was a condominium in the association in Tampa. Within about 3 days, the board president had Googled my name and found out that I was in the industry and said, "Hey, we need somebody that knows how to read a balance sheet, knows about a little bit about community associations. Would you mind to take an open spot on the board?" And being young and not knowing any better, I guess I said, "Sure, I'll be happy to do it." I knew that I did have some background knowledge on the need, and of course, my home was my biggest investment, so I wanted to make sure that it was being taken care of properly. I kind of had done a little bit of homework on the finances of the association, but recognized there was probably, we probably weren't taking in quite enough as was needed. And within a few days on the board, I confirmed that was the case. That we, the prior year we had spent more than we took in. Well, we were running a deficit, and so inevitably the next budget season came around, and we proposed an increase. I think it was $35 or $40, if I remember correctly, per month per unit. But you would have thought it was a lot more. You would have thought we were asking for everyone's firstborn, given the fact that for years and years and years, this community had not seen a single increase in their monthly assessments and the amount that it takes to run the association, which got them into the position where they weren't spending, weren't taking in enough to cover the expenses from the association. They're dipping into prior year savings to pay for things, and so there's a lot of upset folks, I would say, within the community that first year. The second year we quickly realized we needed to get more people involved. We started a budget committee. We did have an increase the second year as well, but the grumblings were a lot less. And now I think are in a better pattern. We will still have increases, insurance increases. We have to increase, but people are not expecting the fees to stay the same year over year over year. So keeping that communication going and keeping up with the costs around us is a big part of this. Inevitably, when it comes to the budget meeting, I'm sure those that have been doing this for a while, there will be someone in the meeting room, an owner most likely, that feels we're taking in too much money, that we don't need all the money that we need, that we're going to be asking for from a monthly assessment. And those are the people I usually like to try to get involved in my budget committee, just so that they understand what the expenses are for. Because knowledge is power when it comes to understanding your budgeting. And it's easy to come to one meeting and complain about the assessment level being too high without understanding all of the great services and supplies, utilities that the association supplies to the community. So if you can, right at your annual meeting, beginning of the year, set out a budget committee, have a few meetings, especially as we start to get into this time of year and we start to see about 6 months of expenses come in. We can review the general ledger and kind of understand where we're going to be, try to do some projections of where the reserve budget is going to be at the end of the year. As you get into the budget time, second half of the year here, you can start to review your current contracts. use that budget committee, folks to volunteer and get involved with talking with your management company or landscaping, you know, your regular contracts, whether that's insurance agents. Give Daniel a call and see what he's seeing for the next year and try to get some estimates on increases, adjustments for next year, new services, maybe bids, maybe contracts are running out. There may be some improvements. There may be some things the association no longer needs as far as the service goes. So reviewing all those service providers again earlier in the year, if you do that this time of year, May, June, July, can be a good place when it comes time to do the budget. In a condominium, the notice must be given to all members, as well as a copy of the proposed budget at least 14 days prior to any meeting for which the annual budget is considered. There are some communities that have like a 30-day requirement in their documents. So you should check your documents, but the state requires at least a 14-day notice that the budget will be considered, as well as a copy of that budget then going out to the membership. Many documents, I see this more in homeowners associations, HOAs, than in co-ops and condos, but they can restrict budget increases from year to year. And so sometimes a unit owner meeting is even necessary to consider an alternate budget that might exceed a certain increase, whether that's a percentage or a dollar amount that's restricted in the documents. The statutes for condos and co-ops do address this issue, and they say that, you know, that if there's a 15%, sorry, 115% of the prior year assessments, that essentially an alternate budget should be considered. This was one of the items that got addressed in HB 913. This piece of legislation that I mentioned is on its way, or will be likely signed by the governor this year. And I don't have it on the slide, but I'll just kind of read from the statutes which I have here. It says, if the board proposes in any fiscal year an annual budget which requires assessments against unit owners which exceed 115% of assessments for the preceding fiscal year, the board shall simultaneously propose a substitute budget that does not include any discretionary expenditures that are not required to be in the budget. The substitute budget must be proposed at the budget meeting before the adoption of the annual budget, at least 14 days before the board shall hand deliver and give the notice, which we just talked about. Now, so this is a change. Historically, the homeowners associations or homeowners would have to propose or petition the board to consider an alternate budget. Now it's saying that the board must simultaneously propose a substitute budget that does not include any discretionary expenditures that are not required to be in the budget. I find that a very interesting statement. And I think it stems from maybe one or two associations that were including things in there that maybe looked at more of as improvements than replacement of like kind or maintenance of the existing services. If you asked me, when I look at my condo association's budget and I look at most budgets, there isn't a lot of discretionary expenditures in there. There's things like landscaping. Well, is landscaping discretionary? I don't think so. I don't think so when it comes to maintaining your community and being able to maintain the values of the units. I'm sure it could be argued that landscaping is discretionary, and you could find someone that says, no, let's just let the landscaping go because it's not going to result in life or death of our community members. I think that discretionary, there's no definition of discretionary, but nonetheless, there is a provision in the statute here that says any determination on whether assessments exceed 150% of the prior year shall exclude authorized provisions for required reserves for repair or replacement of the condominium property, anticipated expenses which does not expect to be incurred on a regular annual basis for the repair, maintenance, or replacement of the items listed in paragraph G, and insurance or premium. So I think at least these, I guess you can look at it as three different items here, are considered not discretionary. Again, they're not going to be part of that 115% calculation at least, and that's again reserves for replacement, repair of the items listed in paragraph G, which are your structural integrity reserves, and insurance of premiums. So at least none of those would be considered discretionary. I don't know what else in most budgets would be considered discretionary items. I suppose there are cases where you have a contingency or something in a budget that could be argued to be discretionary. But if you take away most budgets, if you take away these three things, the reserves, structural integrity reserves, and insurance premiums, and you take those out of the calculations, you'll find probably most budgets are not going to have to increase 115%. year over year. Those are big drivers there for the requirement. So if there's a service change, then that may be what's driving it. And then that would be something that may make sense to have a substitute budget or something that would be considered in addition in lieu of the budget that the board feels is most necessary. So a little bit confusing there on how they added that. Like I said, I think they added a little bit of discretionary there as well. Pardon the pun. So biggest probably mistake I still see with people in their budgets is they start with the assessment level and work backwards. They say, you know, we can collect $300 a month per unit, and so that's how much we have to spend, and they let their income decide the expenses. And I sometimes call that letting the tail wag the dog. It should not be. Unfortunately, that's not the prudent way to go about setting your budget. You need to think about what the expenses are, what it requires, what your community requires to maintain it in an excellent condition, and set the assessments that way. So start with the expenses. I oftentimes wish, I know at the very top we talk about revenues. That's the way most balance sheets and P&L statements work. But I think that really I'd suggest people flip the budget on its head and start with the bottom, work your way up to the top. The top number, the revenues, is what should be the last part calculated on your budget, not the first part. Don't forget some just kind of again tips on the budget. Don't forget in general operating budget. The FHA, Federal Housing Authority, and other lenders, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, are looking at your budgets for adequacy. There is a growing blacklist of properties out there where they will not be eligible for these federally backed loans if they don't have funds available to maintain the amenities. They look for replacement reserves representing at least 10% of the budget. And they're also looking for funds for insurance coverage, adequate insurance coverage, and communities that don't have those are finding themselves on the blacklist. It's very difficult to get mortgages in those communities. And don't forget inflation. We can't keep fees the same year over year without falling behind in the marketplace.
And
yeah,
just for clarity purposes, that 115%, that was specifically on assessments?
Yes, it is the exact wording is which requires assessments against unit owners which exceed 115% of assessments for the preceding fiscal year.
Okay, thank you for that clarity. Someone was confused as to whether or not that was regarding the budget specifically or the assessments, and it's clearly
it's resulting in, right, so the expenses are what's going to drive your revenues, and so the expenses are going to drive the budget and drive the assessments, but that's the wording is specifically requiring assessments against the unit owners which exceed 150% of the preceding fiscal year.
Perfect. And then you had put a QR code on in the beginning of the presentation, and someone in the chat had mentioned that when they went to the QR code, they were able to actually get your slides from there as well. So I'm just going to let everyone know that we'll put that QR code again up maybe at the end.
So, yep, it's on the last slide. Absolutely. So, yep, the slides can be downloaded there. And then, of course, we'll email them out as well if you don't catch them during this presentation. But thanks for those questions. A couple more on the operating budget, then we'll get into reserves. I see a lot of the questions are about reserves as well, and it's an area near and dear to my heart, of course. But when it comes to the general operating budget, the Florida Administrative Code, Florida statutes, and the association's documents all can help us determine what are the top common expenses that are required. The expenses must include all the common expenses. So limited common elements sometimes come into question, but that's where we look at our governing documents to determine whether the maintenance responsibility for our limited common elements should be an expense beared by the association or not. People oftentimes think, well, it's limited common element. That means it's the owner's responsibility. Not necessarily. Limited common element just means it's for the exclusive use of one owner or a group of owners, and not for the use of everyone. So think a driveway or a balcony. It does not determine who is responsible for maintenance or repair of that particular item. Even though no one else can use your balcony, it may still be considered a common element. Working closely with the division, which is I reference the division, the division of condominiums, mobile homes, and timeshares. I just call it the division. They're a subset of the larger Department of Business and Professional Regulation at the state level. They have a whole team of investigators and financial analysts that look and investigate claims from community members or other stakeholders. And one of the big claims that I've seen them call out to associations is a simple one, just disclosing the beginning and ending period of the budget. This applies for both your reserve schedule as well as the operating budget. So don't just put your this is the 2026 budget. Note the date, January 1st, 2026 through December 31st, 2026, because that is what's technically required there. And then two things that often get left off. One, we'll talk about a lot of reserves. Another one is the assessment for each unit type. So if you have one assessment, every unit pays 1/50th of the 50 unit complex, you only need to show once, but often you'll have a proportion of ownership table usually the back of the budget or attached to the budget, showing the assessment for each unit type according to that proportion of ownership. So make sure that's part of the disclosures with your budgets. More so for condos and co-ops than homeowners associations. Homeowner associations usually are just that, 1 divided by the total number of units, and everybody pays the same amount. The last couple on operating budgets. Operating budgets are unrestricted. So the funds that can be put in your budget, whether that's for maintenance or insurance, are not necessarily restricted to that expense. If you have a water bill that runs over, you certainly, and insurance, thankfully, Daniel's able to negotiate a good deal this year. We save a little bit of money in that category. Those funds can be used to cover the water bill that may have gone over budget. The reserve portion, if we're going to restrict the funds, those should be placed in the reserve portion. So operating is unrestricted, reserves are restricted. And then the minutes of the association must reflect the budget, and a copy of the proposed and adopted budgets maintained as part of the record of the association. There's a lot of other disclosures for multi-condominiums and phased condominiums, limited common elements, and developer funding.
Hey, Matt, quick question for you. Just on operating budgets, a sort of generic question came in. I was wondering how you might answer, because I get asked this question also a lot. So on an operating budget, how many months of prior, he says, surplus, do you recommend budgeting for peace of mind? And I guess that could also be asked as how many months of prior expenses do you recommend budgeting for peace of mind?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's not always what can we budget this year for, but what's a target? What's a healthy balance? What's a healthy number that we should be trying to maintain, trying to stay at? And my answer is generally 3 months. I'll say plus or minus 3 months of expenses or assessments as a cushion. 6 months is better, but I don't think that's realistic in all cases. So minimum though, I would say 90 days of surplus, if you will. And really what that is prior earnings, hopefully from prior years. So how do you get there? That becomes a little bit tricky, but I would say if you calculate what you have on hand currently, say it's a month and a half, and you want to get to 3 months, well, you might say, okay, over the next 2 budget years, we're going to try to budget in that extra maybe 6 weeks per budget year of assessments. And so, like I said, if you're say your budget is $120,000 a year, it's $10,000 a month. You might put a contingency in your budget of $15,000 the first year, $15,000 the second year, to eventually build a working capital, if you will, for peace of mind, for budgeting peace of mind. And then hopefully, you don't dip into that. You will have some years where you might need to. You'll hopefully have some years which are a deficit. But you wouldn't want to. And again, if you go over 3 months, 6 months is okay. I've seen associations that will take that all the way up to a year. I think at that point it's probably going a little bit too far in that direction, the conservative direction. So you might actually use some of those funds to offset your assessments in future years to bring it back down to a 3 to 6 month contingency cushion, call it what you will. That's my take on it, Daniel.
Okay, great. And just for everyone again, Keep in mind, we have a lot of people on this webinar today. If you have specific questions about your association, we're not going to be able to handle those because they're going to be on a unique situation by situation basis. We're just not going to have the time for all of that. So if you can make your questions a little bit more generic in nature, we get the benefit of Matt's answer for everyone. And a couple of other real quick points. There is a lot of legislation that's sitting there waiting for the governor's signature, but has not yet been signed into law. I'm going to say Matt's going to steer away from those until the law is actually passed, rather than opining on what could be. And again, lastly, if you could just please use the Q&A for questions. The chat, we're not going to monitor for questions. All right, just back to you, Matt.
Thank you, Daniel. And we got to keep our meetings on focus. No budget meetings in the pool, right? Although we had a little one yesterday. Just kidding. This is an interesting piece of just information out there. The Florida Administrative Code 61B primarily deals with community associations. Chapters 20 and 21 really spell out a lot of the violations that the DBPR sees and enforces, and it's almost like a to-do list of what not to do. So if you're a CAM, these are where you can find out kind of the penalties. This is in a way the rule book for associations condensed down in a couple of tables for the penalties and violations that many community associations, board members, the community association management and firms can get cited with by the division. So it's kind of a little bit of a warning, not to scare anybody. I think it's good to be familiar with that, and you kind of think about things that you may be doing that could be on that list and want to make some adjustments. All right, so let's get into the reserve section here. Some people call it the unknown. I got these little cartoons that someone made long ago, but it's kind of that black hole, that black slice of the pie. We get that question a lot. How much should we have in our reserves? There really isn't a one-size-fits-all. It depends on the community association itself, the amenities that you have, the age of the community, the history, what the association maintains versus what the owners maintain. But we do like to put more and more definitions on it as a community, and that's where your reserve study comes in to help answer that unknown portion of the reserves that or of the budget that is reserves. On average, reserve funds make up anywhere usually between 10 and 50% of the overall budget. Again, a lot depends on the amenities that are maintained by the association. And there's no real one size fits all. You can imagine we have two communities very similar right next to each other. One maintains the windows as a common element. One, the homeowners maintain the windows and doors as a common element. Two completely different reserve funding plans because of that one item. So no one size fits all, but we do try to define reserve expenditures, and the Florida Administrative Code again gives us some definitions that we can rely on. One being a definition of a capital expenditure, which is essentially the purchase or replacement of an asset with a life of more than a year, or an addition to extend the life, of more than 1 year, or deferred maintenance is a repair performed less frequently than annually and resulting in maintaining the useful life of an asset. So a lot of what we have in our reserve schedules are expenditures. They're replacements of the roof or replacements of a railing. But deferred maintenance comes in. We talk about a lot of our concrete structures getting concrete restoration or painting. I think those all fall into that deferred maintenance category. And that's really it. You can have reserves for other things. So we get a lot of questions. I'm not sure if we have one in the chat yet, but there probably will be one before the day is over about, should I have a reserve for my hurricane deductible or storm deductible or storm cleanup? Should I reserve for those items? And I think the answer to that is yes, but I don't think it meets these definitions of a reserve item. So it kind of falls more into what we were talking about before with a working capital. So going back to that question, that was a good one about how many months of working capital. That would be without any funds of it, setting aside funds for insurance deductible or storm cleanup. If you've got $1 million deductible, I think it makes sense to start to try to build up some funds to help offset that. Daniel, you may have a take on that too, with it being on the insurance side of things, but you have uninsured trees in your HOAs, you have uninsured items, that certainly can result in bigger expenses. You know, and so it's a good idea to have other reserves for things like that, but I don't think they meet these two definitions of purchase of an asset or maintenance of or repair of an asset.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, there's a lot of times that, especially with commercial property policies, a lot of the carriers are they don't want to cover what we call property in the open, so things like signage, light posts, things of that nature. And so you will have coverage for the most important elements, the buildings and cabanas and things of that nature, but you may not have for these ancillary outdoor items. That's the type of stuff you might want to keep some money in reserves for in case you do have a storm and you have to replace them and they're not covered by your policy. We do have a question here that's on budgeting. I'll ask you. It says currently we're collecting the total amount required for both SERS and traditional. Are we required to fund to the indicated amount in each SERS or traditional shown in the study, or can we more heavily fund on traditional and then move it over as needed?
Interesting question. Okay, so the question obviously is pertaining to a condominium or cooperative that has structural integrity reserves. For those that we don't talk much about that yet, but SERS is a structural integrity reserve study. It was a stat. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but generally the statute says that you must, the budget must include the funding for your structural integrity reserve study items based on the last structural integrity reserve study. So you have to follow the structural integrity reserve portion. You don't necessarily have to follow the traditional or the non-structural portion of the reserves, but I would say you'd want to have a good business reason, a business case to veer from that amount. Joan, that's a good question.
Yeah, sorry if I got ahead on that one, but it seemed pertinent.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, let me get to we'll get to before we get to too many more SERS questions. We'll jump into that. We'll talk about this, but generally from a high level, I want to think about reserve because this I think it's kind of basic stuff, but it's at the same time it becomes the root of a lot of issues with community associations. It's really at the heart of a lot of the infighting that we can see in communities, and it's an opportunity, I think, for us to take a step back as board members and say, hey, what is really my job here? Because none of your neighbors, I'll promise you, not one of your neighbors wants to pay more in their monthly reserve assessment or monthly assessments to their community association than they need to. It's just a fact of life. It's natural. But and I'm sure we have communities, and you probably heard it too, Daniel, we can't afford this or that in our community. We can't afford to fund our reserves, or we can't afford to fully fund our reserves. We hear that a lot. And I think from an owner's perspective, they're looking out for them. And I think what they're usually saying when they say that is that they don't want to pay for it, not that they can't afford it, but they don't want to pay for their upkeep and maintenance of the community. They'd rather let the next owners or the next people worry about that, or worry about that when the time comes, instead of planning and being proactive on it. But at the heart of why we're on our board, and one of the things when you have owners that are objecting to the fee increases, I think we have to remind folks that we're making those decisions as a board to protect their investment. That is really the main job of the board. So much other stuff gets in the way of that job. Sometimes we get distracted from that job, but our job is to protect the investment. Sometimes, millions, not tens or hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property and investment that you as a volunteer board member are responsible for. So never forget that there's a business that we're running here, and protecting the investments is at the heart of doing the reserves. Because when communities have reserves for their projects, they have the ability to get them done. Without money, it's impossible to do those deferred maintenance or capital expenditures. It's just the boards can't do, their hands become tied. And so we want to avoid special assessments. I often times when people say, well, we can't afford that, our membership can't afford the reserves, it would price everybody out of this complex, and no one would live here, values would crash, et cetera, et cetera. I like to think about I like to ask them what the alternatives are. So if you aren't going to reserve for an item, you can do a special assessment. So the roof, let's just say a roof in a condo, it doesn't care really whether you've you've saved for it or not, it's going to one day say, I'm reached the end of my life. I'm cracked. My seams are separated and I'm starting to leak. And you have a few options. You can try to repair for a while to extend the life. You can special assess and replace it. You might be able to get financing to replace it, or you can do nothing. Those are kind of the four options. And so when people say, well, we can't afford to reserve, I remind them of the other options that would have for that roof, and ask them, well, which one of those is a less expensive route? Which one of those is going to be easier to afford for your community? And people say, well, most of the time, none of those are any less expensive and easier to afford. Most people will say, well, hopefully we won't live here and be party to that special assessment. We'll have sold our units by then. So that's one mentality that a board member can have, but I think it gets away from the fiduciary duty of a board. Again, when it comes to protecting those investments. So I sometimes call this the F word, but the fiduciary means to have the highest standard of care to whom you own the duty, right? So in this case, it's you owe the duty to the Community Association Inc., Condominium Association Incorporated, whatever it might be. So when we hear people say, and I hear this a lot, we're not going to be here when the roof needs to be replaced. Why would we worry about that? 20 years from now, we'll be long gone. So let's not worry about the next concrete restoration. Well, if it's a board member saying that, and they're saying that I'm going to be gone, they're putting their own personal situation in front of the duty, I just flat out ask them, where's the Condominium Association Incorporated going to be in 10 years or 20 years? Is it still going to be here? Or are you planning on that being gone too? And who are you making decisions for when you're in this board meeting? Is it for the condominium association? Is it for your own personal interest? So that's a hard concept, I think, for a lot of people to grasp, but it is really important to think that way. Another thing we try to think about is, the folks that are there and living there, whether they're there for 6 months, 6 years, 16 years, or 60 years, we really want to try to create equity within our communities. So many communities say, well, I'm not, we're going to live there for the first 20 years. We're going to waive the reserves, and then we're going to move out. And then sure enough, the next buyer, young couple moves in that has just moved in, and now they're paying for a whole bunch of special assessments because the prior boards didn't, or the prior membership didn't set aside reserves for those items, or they're having to get financing. Just makes for a less harmonious community. It makes for less equity, I think is the best word for it, between community members, and just doesn't show that in my opinion, doesn't show the leadership that the board has to make. Sometimes leadership involves tough decisions. So as board members, I know you don't get paid a lot to be on that board. It's a volunteer job. We all recognize that, but it does have a heavy responsibility as a fiduciary. And so keeping your reserves in mind and reminding folks of that responsibility, reminding folks of the job of protecting the investment, hopefully makes your job easier in the long run. To have that schedule. It also creates some consistency. I know many people get on their boards with a specific agenda and item that they want to take care of, and it's easy to get sidetracked, to get off track if a new board member comes on every year. And 1 year we're working on the 1 year is a financial priority, which is maybe where you're at, and then the next year swimming pool people get on the board. They want the pool refinished, and then the tennis players come on the board and they want the tennis, and all of those things are important to the community without question, right up to the discretionary cosmetic things of landscaping and lobby renovations. They're extraordinarily important to the overall value of the community, but they all have to be part of a holistic plan, and they can't be a part of any individual agenda. And having a good reserve schedule with those items on it does lend to some consistency year over year and helps make the board able to accomplish their job, their responsibilities. And then why reserve from a manager's perspective? What's good for the boards and the membership should be good for the managers. I'll just kind of leave it at that. Having the money again to take care of the property, you're going to see a better, more well-maintained property, and you're going to see hopefully less fights about budget increases and budgeting in general. And then, of course, managers have an extra layer of responsibility in that they're kind of required to comply with all the laws and all the requirements. So let's talk first about condos and co-ops for reserves. The statute since 1984 has said the same thing, that the budget shall include reserves for capital replacements, deferred maintenance, roof replacement, building painting, and pavement resurfacing, regardless of the amount of deferred cost of that. And then for any other item for which the deferred maintenance expense or cost exceeds $10,000. So this is and has been the law for condos and co-ops in the state of Florida for many, many years, more than 40 years now. House Bill 913 kind of recognized that $10,000 in 1984 was maybe a lot more money than it is today. And so that new bill is now says cost that exceeds $25,000 or the inflation adjusted amount determined by the division, which the division is now going to have to come out. I guess they say annually, they'll have to come out with a new amount. So that this is the current law. July 1st, we expect this threshold to be cost exceeds $25,000, which coincidentally is the equivalent of $10,000 in 1984 dollars today. So this is still a requirement, whether you have to get a SERS or not for a condo or a co-op. We'll talk about homeowners associations here in a little bit. Additionally, for all condos, co-ops, and even homeowner association reserve funds have been restricted. Their use can only be used for their authorized purpose, authorized reserve expenditures, unless their use for other purpose is approved in advance by a majority vote at a duly called meeting of the association. So reserves must be in the budget for condos and co-ops, and they're restricted as to use for condos and co-ops. Required reserve disclosures. This is very important. We talked about them a little bit with the budgeting, but make sure we put a reserve schedule attached to each budget. Again, disclosing the beginning and ending period of the schedule, listing the items in the reserve, the useful life, the remaining useful life, replacement cost, and then the starting balance and required contribution. The last two items are different, whether you have pooled reserves or what some kind called component or straight line reserves. If you have pooled reserves, you just have one overall starting balance for the pool, and you have one contribution for the pool. If you have individual items, restricted reserves for components, you'd have a starting balance for each component and a contribution for each component. Very important to keep this, that this should be going out again with your proposed budget as well as your any approved budget. This is part of your budget schedule. People often think, well, pooled reserves, you don't have a schedule that attaches to it. That's false. Pooled reserves would still have all of these items: replacement cost, useful life, remaining useful life, and name of the item, as well as overall pooled contributions and balances.
Matt, I've heard a lot of different things about pooling reserves, and we have a question in the chat about pooled reserves. Do you want to maybe expand on that just a little bit? The gentleman's asking if you feel that pooled reserves would be advisable to reduce the monthly dues. The management company is suggesting it, but I've also heard a lot of times that it's a bear to try to get pooled reserves for multiple communities, and it's not advisable for many. So do you want to just touch upon that?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a little bit of perspective. Again, we work in 50 states and 30 countries. Florida is unique, and they're the only ones that does not use pooled reserves within any kind of large way. The statutory requirements until about 2002, so over 20 years ago now, required reserves to be restricted by item. And then in 2002, sorry, they changed the administrative code to allow for pooling. So we do still see a lot of communities in Florida using those segregated reserves, but majority are switching to pooled for two main reasons. One of them, I think, is a double-edged sword. One is that it gives flexibility, and maybe they're both double-edged sword. But there's two main differences and two considerations to think about. The pooled reserves offer flexibility, so the money can be spent now on any item within the pool, as opposed to this prior slide, which said the money can only be used for its authorized purpose. So if you have a shortfall in your painting reserve, but you got a lot of money in a roof reserve and the roof's not needed for 5 or 10 more years, if you're pooled, you wouldn't have those two categories. You'd use the money as needed. If you're a component method, you'd have to go to the ownership to get the money to vote to move the reserves from the roof reserve to the painting reserve. Add on this the new SERS restrictions, and you cannot get an owner vote. That money has to stay restricted. So less flexibility for boards with the component reserves based to pooled. again, that's one I think you could say that's a double-edged sword. Should boards get that flexibility? Should they be required to get a vote of the membership? Maybe, but just knowing how difficult of a job it is and how difficult it is to estimate where you're going to need all the money in one place to establish those additional restrictions above and beyond where we would see in any other state, any other country, usually is not necessary. The other kicker usually to get people to switch to pooled reserves is that it's often a lot less money needed. And why is that? Well, you spend the same amount in either methodology, but when you have 10, 20, 40 different items that you have segregated funds for, you've got money kind of stashed away in each of those little buckets, and you never really reserve a minimum amount. You're never looking at a baseline reserve, which I'll show towards the end of the program here. So it's oftentimes, I just had one where I think it was 4x to fund component reserves versus pooled reserves. So many are, I think that may be the heart of this question when the management companies advising go to a pooled system. It just makes much more financial sense to go to pooled reserves for most communities. We can still talk about leaving a threshold in the pool. We can build in some factor of safety in the pooled reserves, but I think it in a vast majority of cases, it is advisable to use the pooled method. But I will say, if your community is always reserved at the component level, it is a more conservative way to reserve. So there's less risk involved. So I say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's an old adage, but I think it applies here as well. If you're able to fund all of your individual components and you're able to maintain a high reserve balance in a conservative spot, keep doing that. But usually what we see is an insufficient component list, an item, where we're missing several items, or the remaining useful lives are overstated, or the replacement costs are understated. So when we're coming in as reserve providers, and this is consistent within our industry, we're often recommending a significant increase to the reserve funding. And one way to make that more palatable is to look at funding it based on a pooled reserve as opposed to individual component reserves for most communities. You can have a hybrid. You can have some items pooled, some items component. Like I said, you can build in in your pool. You can build in some contingency. We call it threshold, to where even at the lowest point, the pooled reserve doesn't run completely out of money. So you've got a little bit of backup there for any items in the pool that are needed there. So I think it's good to look at both, but hopefully that answers the question. Yeah, I think it is advisable in a lot of cases. It makes a lot of sense.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, good question. So we had to change, of course, due to the tragic events that happened almost now 4 years ago, June 24th of 2021. We had the tragic collapse of the Surfside Tower, or Champlain South Tower in Surfside, Florida, and the 98 innocent lives lost. Was a shock to our whole industry, our whole community association world in the state of Florida will never be the same, I don't think. We were a part of many of the task forces and studies that were done after the collapse. There's still studies going on, right? And the NIST hasn't put out their final report on what what tragically made the building collapse. But there was several things came to light shortly after in the months, I would say, after the tragedy, that the legislature felt was very important to adjust. One was that it was a very low threshold to waive or partially fund reserves for our condominium associations. It was simply a majority of a quorum could waive the funding on reserves. So if you had a 100-unit building and you needed 20 people to arrive at a meeting for it to be a quorum, let's say you had 20 people and you got 11 of those people to vote to waive the reserves. So now you've got 11 people could waive all of the reserves for a 100-unit building, with 89 people either not knowing or opposed to that. So that low threshold put boards in an impossible decision. We saw that in this case study. We see that in many boardings. This building tragically didn't, they knew they had some significant expenses. They didn't have the money to do that, to do those expenses. The boards tried to get financing, but because of owner occupancy rates, they couldn't get financing. It was put that board in an impossible decision. They knew they had repairs to do, but they couldn't get the money to do it. Eventually, after a couple of years went by, they were able to get the funds They were able to get financing for the project, but unfortunately, we don't know what would have happened if that would have project would have gone differently if there's other factors there. But nonetheless, that was a difficult situation that a lot of boards find themselves in and will continue to find themselves in without a change. So that was kind of one of the main things they wanted to change. No independent inspections required. So this was something that was studied nationwide and actually worldwide to determine, what happens to the building. We do a lot of inspections. We do a lot of reviews to get the permits to build a building. Then we turn it over and give a certificate of occupancy. There is no, outside of Miami-Dade and Broward, that had a requirement due to another tragedy in the 70s. There was no requirement for recertification or looking at the building statewide, and the recognition of in this extreme environment. And we saw it in other cities as well. It's usually a tragedy, whether it's a facade ordinance that comes into place because of chunks of the building falling off or something else. A re-inspection program is probably necessary at some point in a building's life, and this was debated at large extent. I think we landed on about 30 years and every 10 years thereafter in our state. But certain cities have it every 4-year critical facade examination because of chunks of buildings, again, that have been falling out. There's different items, but we knew we needed something there to say, at some point, our condominium buildings have to be relooked at by qualified professionals, because the property owners themselves, the boards, are not proactively doing this in all cases, unfortunately. There was some concern, there's a major concern about the lists, right? So we always had that roofing, painting, paving list, and then anything else over $10,000. I felt that was probably an appropriate list. It's just that no one was following it because they're saying, well, plumbing is out of sight, out of mind. We don't think it's on the list necessarily, even though, yes, it's well over $10,000, and they'd leave it out. They'd leave out electrical systems, and leave out waterproofing that might be below the plaza, the pool deck, above the garage. You can see the leak coming through there. There's a membrane there, but you can't see it, so they would leave it out. Oftentimes get left out of its reserve study. So that's one of the things I say, no real thought on long-lived. There's some long-lived elements, but at some point those items too have to be pulled into the study and into the schedule, and they weren't being done. So they expanded the list to address that issue. And then they wanted to control, especially the Florida House, saw the pictures of the beautiful lobby and the new furniture at the pool at the Champlain Tower South building, right next to the structure, the crumbling concrete. And they said, look, boards are in a difficult position, and they're prioritizing the cosmetic items, the sexy items, the things that, the first things you see when you go to sell a unit, or a realtor comes in to look at to price out a unit, and they're doing that at the segregator, I'm sorry, the word is escaping right now, but at the downfall, there it is, downfall of the structural components and some of the back of the house things that aren't there. So they said no more spending structural safety reserves on cosmetic items. They really wanted to control that. So we ended up with a new type of reserves and a new type of reserve study called Structural Integrity Reserve Study, also known as a SIRS. It's basically a reserve fund required for residential condominiums every 10 years for property that is 3 stories or higher than height. So buildings that have 3 or more stories. This was changed in House Bill 913. Again, if it gets signed, it is going now. It says 3 habitable stories or higher. So we have a lot of buildings that have maybe garage on the first floor with 2 stories of residential. They were required under the laws that are in place right now to do a structural integrity reserve study, but unless they now have 3 habitable floors, and habitable means places really made for living, so living spaces, kitchens, bedrooms, living rooms would all be considered habitable. So if you have those items only on 2 stories of a 3-story building, or a 4-story building, I guess, for that matter, if it's only two stories of habitable, then they do no longer need to have the structural integrity reserve study, which is a big change. I'm not sure the thought process behind it. I think they were just trying to point to something that would give relief to some condominium owners. So now it's 3 habitable stories or higher in height. Why 3 stories, not 2 stories, not 4 stories, not 5 stories? Still haven't got a good answer on that, but that's kind of where it stands, is 3 stories. So I think I see some questions in here. I see one in there from Frank. We're 10 buildings, 2 stories each with 8 units per building. How often do we need a reserve study? So according to the law, Frank, you are not going to need a reserve. You do not have to do a reserve study by law. That's not going to be a statutory requirement because you're not 3 habitable stories or higher in height. Best practice, though, every 3 years to do one. It's a great tool to have, but best practices so I want to just distinguish that. If you don't have a condominium 3 habitable stories or higher in height, you don't need this. There's also a section in the statute that formally or currently says single family, 2-family, and 3-family dwellings are exempt from this if they're 3 stories or less. They're exempt, or fewer than, I think it's fewer than 3 stories. They added to that 4-unit dwelling. So if you have a 4-unit dwelling, 3-story building, or even a 4-story building that has 3 habitable floors, I think it does not need a structural integrity reserve study. So they just carved out a little bit, I think, around the requirements of who needs to get these studies here in SB 913. If you're an 18-story tower, it's going to be the same. This doesn't impact you. Here's the list of items that they felt were most important. I guess I'll say they called it the structural integrity reserve study. It includes some structural items. Some things I think are questionable, but the roof, structure including load-bearing walls, primary structural members, primary structural systems, fireproofing, fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical, waterproofing, painting, exterior windows and doors, and again, a catch-all, any other item that has a cost that exceeds $10,000 and the failure to maintain or replace it would negatively affect one of the items in A through G. So best example of this might be your seawall. If it's right up against the foundation of the structure and it costs more than $10,000, it's likely going to be the structure, the person conducting the portion of the structural integrity reserve study is likely going to add that in, even though seawall is not specifically required here. That same seawall on the other side of the golf course or across the parking lot, may not be part of this structure because its failure may not negatively impact the structure there. Swimming pool, if it's on the top of the roof or on the garage, top of the garage structure, plaza deck, 6 floors in the air, it's probably going to be considered structural. Swimming pool in the ground on the other side of the parking lot, probably not going to be considered structural. Of note, 913 changes this to 25,000 as well. So that's and I guess I don't know if we have other questions. Frank asks about specific items, right? So this is the list. You still have the other list that says any expense over 10,000, now soon to be 25,000, must be included in the reserves. But you'll notice like air conditioning equipment, elevators are not on this list. And so those items would have to be reserved separately. That's where someone called it a traditional reserve. I would call it maybe a non-structural reserve or a general reserve. There's different names that you give to it, but it's still required to have reserves for those items. They're just not part of this specific study as mandated. So I think there was a question in there. Shoot, I lost it. But anyway, there's probably other items that we could talk about and debate whether they should be on this list or not. But nonetheless, here's the list, and that did not change. The list outside of the $25,000, the items listed there did not change in the latest revision. And now the amount must be reserved. I think we mentioned this earlier. The amount that the association is required, if you're required to obtain a SERS, the reserves maintained for those items must be based on the findings and recommendations of the association's most recent structural integrity reserve study. So essentially, you have to do the SERS and you have to follow it. For a budget adopted on or after December 31st, the members of an association essentially may not be able to provide no reserves or less reserves than required by this section. There is a caveat that we'll talk about. Right now, the alternative funding method is defined as a funding method obligations for a multi-condominium operating at least 25 condominiums, which can be fully satisfied using the funding through the operating budget. This changed, so they expanded this again to offer some more relief. Now, any condominium, they changed this, so they removed the 25 condominiums. Any multi-condominium can fund reserves using this alternative method. but presumably the division is going to have to approve that or approve some way to show that for those multi-condominiums. So if you have a multi-condominium, you may have an out here given this new legislation.
So Matt, a question just as far as reserve advisors is concerned. Megan is asking whether or not reserve advisors would be the right people to contact in order to understand what should be classified in the SERS versus non-structural reserves.
Yes, yeah, we certainly can, or any reserve. So we'll talk a little bit about the specific credentials, but you'd have to have a PE, an architect, PE being a licensed professional engineer in the state of Florida, an architect registered in the state of Florida, a professional reserve analyst, or a reserve specialist. We have 3 of the 4 of those designations. So yes, our firm would certainly be one that could help provide guidance on that. But there's others out there as well.
Okay, and I see that we're only about halfway through the slides. I want to give you the time to go through them, so I'm going to hold off on more questions for the time being, just until you tell me you're ready for more.
Well, yeah, we'll fly through. I think there's some more stuff with the new legislation that we'll get into, but I want to get the baseline of where it stands and want to get to some homeowners association stuff too. So thank you for that.
Yep.
I think we covered this actually already. They're restricted. So here's a lot of pictures on these next few slides. So when we say structure, what they're not really talking, we don't need to worry about replacement, hopefully, of our structures. That was an initial topic. What we essentially changed it to is now any repairs that are needed within the next 25 years, our remaining useful life of 25 years or less. And it may be a repair instead of replacement. And when it comes to our structures, concrete structures, I know we had PD Concrete Solutions on earlier. They're busy as heck doing concrete restoration, which is kind of like a root canal for our buildings. So I described it to someone this morning. It's you dig out the steel, you dig out all the concrete that's cracked or spalled over time, down to what we call clean steel, the reinforcing steel in there that's no longer rusted. Because as that steel rusts, it really expands. They want to get down to kind of clean, unrusted steel, and then rebuild with new steel and new concrete, rebuild sections of the columns, beams, balconies. You can see a few pictures of that type of thing here. Very, very expensive and very important to maintain the structural stability of the building. Waterproofing, of course, can be liquid applied membranes, but also some, I was talking before about plaza decks. We see a lot of these pool decks, elevated pool decks with landscaping and irrigation and beautiful looks above, with little stalactites hanging from the ceiling in the garage below. The picture in the lower left corner was actually taken from a screenshot of a picture from the Champlain Tower South building, and you can see the gutter system that was installed here to kind of keep the water from dripping on the cars below, recognizing that, yes, water's infiltrating through this system, and this system is a roof. You can see it removed in the picture on the left here, but it's basically essentially a roof below the brick pavers that over time will, just like any roof, start to fail and allow water through. So if you start to see white staining on the roof, you see those kind of stalactites coming down from the roof, that's a good indication that that plaza membrane or the waterproofing there has failed and will need to get replaced. And the only way to do that is to remove all the brick, all the landscaping, all the irrigation, everything off the upper portion and reapply it. So it's a very expensive proposition, but nonetheless an important one that's often overlooked. Plumbing, again, I don't know if it's really structural, but nonetheless, you will have water plumbing, waste plumbing, vent plumbing, perhaps HVAC plumbing, roof drains, etc. Electrical life safety systems, so your fireproofing, fire alarm systems, all are part of the structural reserve as well. Again, I don't know that they're necessarily structural by some definitions, but they are structural in the fact that they are the requirement to be in a structural integrity reserve study, must be funded, must be set aside. Railings, I think railings kind of fall into this category again. If you don't maintain railings that are posted into the concrete structure, they will damage the wall. I think the seawall and the swimming pool here in this picture on the lower left, probably not structural. This one on the right, where it gets real close to the building, I think that might be one our engineers would consider structural, but there's some factors that they would take into account to determine whether or not that would be a structural portion or a non-structural portion of the building. Elevators are not structural, well, much to this poor guy's dismay. The elevator stopped working and now he's going to get his arms taken off. But the equipment hoisted, very, very expensive equipment here, but I don't think it meets the list on structural. Same with HVAC, not structural, not part of the structural integrity reserve study. So here we talked about this a little bit. Any must be the engineer, architect, or a person certified as a reserve specialist or a professional reserve analyst by the Community Associations Institute or the Association of Professional Reserve Analysts. Here's the language. A lot of this is just language stuff for your reference. I mentioned this earlier. The CERS may recommend that reserves for replacement do not need to be maintained for items with an estimated remaining useful life of more than 25 years. So again, the foundation of the building, if we don't think anything's going to be needed for it for the next 25 years, it does not need to be in the CERS. But if there's a deferred maintenance expense or a remaining useful life of a component that's less than 20 or 25 years or less, then it must be funded in the reserves. There's some requirements. Developers have to also they change the turnover inspection report. So they've got CERS categories in there as well. So the developers should be doing this right away. And then it says existing associations that were existing when the first law went into place, July 1st, 2022, must have their CERS completed by December 31st, 2024. So that deadline's passed. The legislature rewarded those who waited, and now the deadline is going to get moved to December 31st, 2025. Again, property that's 3 habitable stories or higher in height. The statutes include requirement that if you've breached this, if you willfully and knowingly failure to have a milestone inspection performed, or if you fail to complete a structural integrity reserve study pursuant to this paragraph, such failure is a breach of the director and officer's fiduciary relationship. So it's a breach of your fiduciary duty, called right out in the statute. If you don't do this, I think the bigger, people ask, well, what division's not going to necessarily know. People aren't going to know if we did it or not. Your buyers, your mortgage companies, your insurance companies are all going to if they haven't already, they're going to start asking for copies of the information and wanting to make sure that you have it before they write mortgages in your community. It's also part of all now the condominium rider on a real estate closing forms in the state, disclosing that you've done the CERS and you've given a copy of it if it's done to the buyer, and if not, it's past due as of right now.
Yeah, we're starting to see it, Matt. The 40-year and CERS, we're starting to see those as a requirement for D&O insurance. That's been coming out a lot more right now. There's a new requirement by the carriers looking for these reports to make sure that we're in compliance, and they're getting more and more strict about it.
Thank you. Yes, I just actually closed the link here. I'll put my content. I see there's a question about my content from folks. Don't worry, I'll make sure you guys get that after listening to me for this long. You deserve it at least. So yes, transparency is key, Daniel. There is now a requirement that the association also notify the membership within 45 days of receiving the CERS report, and they must notify the division also within 45 days of receiving the report. The division created a database, so you can click condos.myfloridalicense.com and look for some of the reporting links here, and it lists all the associations that have completed the CERS as well as the statement that it was completed. So here's just a screenshot of that reporting. So anyone can now go online and look for your building and see if you've done this required reporting form. The state's reporting form, just for your information, does not have or it asks for a copy of the structural integrity reserve study. It also asks for how much you paid for the structural integrity reserve study. Both of those fields are not required. It doesn't say that on there, but you do not have to fill that information out or give the state a copy of your structural integrity reserve study. You got to give that to the members and make sure that's available to your members. That is not something that has to go to the division. So let's maybe before we go, let's get into HOAs, then we can come back to more questions, because I know the HOA people have been waiting patiently to talk about their communities as well. So 720, Florida Statute 720 pertains to homeowners associations. And they're a little bit different in that their reserves are kind of more of an opt-in provision. So it says the reserves must be maintained and the use is restricted if it was originally established by a majority vote of the homeowners. So if a board decided to establish their own reserves in a homeowners association, that might be unrestricted or non-statutory reserves, sometimes called voluntary reserves. And they don't have the protections afforded in the statute for those reserves. If the homeowners voted, again, a majority vote of the homeowners, which I believe is like majority of the voting interest, voted to have established a reserve, and the vote must include the name of the reserve that's being established and what it's for, then they would be restricted reserves. So most homeowners associations that I deal with do not have statutory reserves. The boards have been prudent and set aside some funds, but they're unrestricted by their nature. If the association and an HOA does not provide for reserve accounts, then they have some pretty large disclaimers on their financial reporting, essentially saying, this is a lot of language on these slides. I'm not going to read it all, but essentially just saying that the association has not provided for accounts, and that increases the likelihood of special assessment for those items. May result in a special assessment. So warning, no reserves of this community. When you do have restricted reserves, they're much like condos in an HOA. They must designate the reserves. They must be funded, waived, or have their funding waived by a majority. And again, this is now a majority of the voting interests. If you don't get that vote or you don't get a quorum, the meeting that's to be considered, then the full funding amount must go into place for 1 year. And just like in condos, you can have pooled or component reserves. And similar to the question earlier, I think pooled is advisable in most cases. The reserve study process, physical and financial analysis. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but suffice to say, physical analysis is getting the right items on the list, getting a realistic useful life, and getting a realistic replacement cost. If you've got those three things, you're in great shape. Your battle is mostly won there, and then that's when you determine, once you know the expenses based on the items, name of the items, the useful lives and replacement costs, then determining the financial analysis is where you'll get your results. And essentially, the expenditures have to equal what you have in savings plus what you're going to contribute. A couple of slides here on the component method. I think we kind of answered this question earlier, but the component method, oftentimes straight line method, is essentially straight line depreciation of each item. Here's a quick example. If you've got a roof with a replacement cost of $535,000, it's got a 5 years of remaining useful life, and you've got $335,000 in the bank, means your residual balance, so the unfunded portion of that roof, is $200,000. That's the difference between the cost and what you currently have, $200,000. You like how I keep the math simple on this here? Divide that by 5 remaining years, meaning we got to contribute $40,000 per year for the roofs to ensure that the funds are there. Painting, same thing, $30,000, and all those are added up to get the required contribution, required assessment for reserves for component method. One of the let's see if that question comes up before I go there. The pooled method is similar in that it identifies, again, useful life replacement cost here, but instead of depreciating each item, we look at the total outlays of cash over the next, oftentimes 30 years. That's the national standard, is 30-year look at outflows of cash, and then we determine through a little bit of trial and error what level of inflows is necessary to keep the balance from dropping below zero. And you can see the low point in this case was 2027, when they've only got $32,000 in the bank. We talked about this earlier, the pooled method, you could build a bigger threshold in there. If you want to say we never want the pooled reserve to drop below 100,000, we can set that as a low point and determine the funding inflows needed to make sure that stays above 100,000 in that particular case. But just like many cases, and this is only a simple example of 5 line items, the reserve contribution for pooled is $75,000 for this group. Component was $85,000 for this group. So that's not uncommon. In fact, it's oftentimes much higher than that. The more items that you get, the more buckets that you'd have to fill with those component reserves to to fund the reserves with the pooled, with component reserves much higher than pooled reserves. Oh, this is just the same example with no inflation put on this slide. We included the 3% inflation and a 2% interest calculation. Pretty common to put a nominal rates in there, but you could look at it, and in some cases, people look at it all in today's dollars. Zero interest, zero inflation. Doesn't really impact the first year, but it does impact those out years. What I don't like about this is it kind of implies maybe that we can keep the fee the same year over year over year by contributing 75,000. We talked about that earlier with budgeting. That's not a good place to be. You'll see the prior example where we had inflation. Not only are our expenses going up by 3%, but our contributions, the inflows to the reserve, are going up by 3% as well each year, so that people are setting aside more as time goes on and the value of the dollar decreases. But anyway, all of this is the same present day value. Switching from one to the other, board can vote to pool reserves in future budgets. Homeowners must vote to move any existing reserves into a pool account. There was some language on this in 913, basically saying the same thing. A board can decide without homeowner vote to which accounting method to use or to switch from one accounting method to the other. Still not clear to me on what happens with the existing reserves. I would make sure that you get owner, or at least your attorney, to chime in on how to use those existing reserves if you're going to move those from a straight line reserve into a component reserve, or I'm sorry, into a pooled reserve. You want to make sure that you're getting any necessary votes. I don't think the new language really changes that. It changes the accounting. You can change the accounting method, but I don't think it changes the funds that are set aside historically. And my last few slides are just examples of fully funding the reserves. I'm sorry, just the funding goals. So fully funding is a very confusing term. And so I like to just spend a couple of minutes on that, and then we can get to a lot of questions. But full funding in our industry, being the reserve industry, being the National Reserve Study Standards, is defined as maintaining a fully funded balance. Oftentimes, casually in Florida, we'll say having fully funded reserves really means your budget is fully funded. Well, what's the difference? So let's use a simple example of a roof, $100,000 a year cost of a roof. Let's say it has a 10-year life, just to keep the math simple for me. In year 5, the fully funded balance of that roof is going to be halfway through its life. It's going to be $50,000, going to be half the cost of the roof. In year 7, the fully funded balance is going to be $70,000, etc. So to have a fully funded balance for your community, you'd have to have the exact proportionate share of roof money, plus painting, plus paving, plus structure, plus plumbing, plus electrical, plus everything added together to determine the fully funded balance of the association. And then, the percentage of money that you actually have inside would be your percent funded. And so fully funding, again, according to this national definition, is 100% funded balance. But in Florida, we often say, like I said, fully funding the budget. So that take that same roof, 10 years old, 10-year life, $100,000, and let's say it's 7 years old, but the previous 7 years, the owners have voted to waive the reserve. So we're 0% funded. We've got $0 in the bank for this roof that's 7 years old. Unfortunately, it's a situation a lot of our communities find themselves in. Yet their budget can still be fully funded as long as next year they set aside $33,334 in the budget, so that they'll have $100,000 when it comes time to replace that roof in 3 years, because it's in year 7. It's got 3 years to go. So that's kind of more looked at, and that's I think some of the confusion stems from that. That having a fully funded reserve just really means that you'll have enough money when the item is needed, and so that's where these other two methods come into play. The threshold and baseline method, as defined in the National Study Standards, looks at the cash flow of reserves, which we're kind of looking at there in the prior slides as well. That determines the reserves never fall below a certain, fall below 0, and that's the way the administrative code's written. 913 includes a statement here that says the funds must be at a minimum hit a target of baseline funding, meaning the balance of the reserve never falls below $0 over the length of the cash flow. Threshold just refers to it's going to be some point above 0. That's going to be the low point on your reserves. And statutory reserves at the national standards, just there's some states that have other requirements. In Florida, full funding, threshold funding, and baseline funding are all acceptable ways to achieve it. Baseline being the least conservative method, the lowest funding requirement, full funding being the most conservative, requiring the most dollars. Quick case study. So to get to 100% funded, this was a building that was 130 unit condo, coming up on 30 years old. They did have $1 million in the bank, but they were only 38% funded. And that's pretty common. You know, they're not, most associations are not going to be anywhere close to 100% funded in my experience. We identified $5 million of expenses. We did a 20-year, just for quick purposes here, 20-year analysis, $5 million of expenses. And they're setting aside about $190,000 a year currently. But in order to get them, and this is what people thought when the law first came out, is that we've got to get to 100% funded and we only have 2 years to get there. How are we going to do that? Well, that would require a very significant jump to go from 38% funded to 100% funded in 2 years. In this case, it was going to be almost $600 per month per unit. And you see it goes from 38% funded to 100% funded and then maintains this high balance, the blue line being the balance here in this graph over the next 20 years. 5 years to get there is a little bit more of a gradual path, still increase $269 per month per unit to get there, and then maintaining a high reserve. It took 20 years to get there. Here's what that would look like, $119 per month per unit. And what this does is it identifies that the balance is 100% of all the depreciated items, or balance of all the items that are in their reserve schedule, which is often a very high number. And in all these cases, they're contributing over $7 million to maintain a very high balance when they only have $5 million of expenses. So thankfully, I think Florida allows us to do what we call threshold or baseline funding, which is more of a cash in, cash out. Instead of maintaining a really high reserve balance, we're able to keep the reserve balance in a more moderated stance. This would be my recommendation: adequate, stable, not excessive cash flow. The percent funded ranges between 30, 40, and 20% or so. And it resulted in an increase of about $30 per month per unit, much more palatable. Essentially taking in 4.5 million or 4.7 million, spending 5 million, it's kind of cash in and cash out. They could go one step further and go baseline funded. The balance never drops below zero, and it was an $8 increase per month per unit. So that same community that was looking at maybe $600 a month to get to 100% funded right away, and then a drop, or $100 a month to get to 100% funded over 20 years, also would have this option to look at an $8 a month increase. I wouldn't recommend this because you're really taking in, again, less money than you're spending over time. But I think the threshold method, this $30 a month increase, was a good fit for this particular community, and acceptable even with structural integrity reserves or component reserve. Sorry, this is a pooled reserve. So with that, that's really my last slide of prepared material. I got through it all with 20 minutes to spare here. I know there's a lot of questions. Daniel, do you want to just start firing away, and I'll do my best to answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. Why don't you load that last slide so people can go to your QR
Oh, yeah, that's right. The QR code. Thank you.
Yeah, and they can do as they please while we're having this discussion. I'm just going to take it from the top and go down questions wherever they may be, and we'll see if it's unique to a particular community and you feel it's too specific, you can just tell me and we'll pass on it. Okay, so starting from the top, this is really a question. It says, is it so that full funding after this last legislation is not mandatory?
Great question. And I didn't get into that, but the last session did include, in addition to the carve-outs we talked about, it includes some additional language. And I'm going to read it just to be specific here, because I'm not super familiar with it just yet. But it does say, and I was involved with actually the drafting of some of this stuff. It says reserves for the items listed in paragraph G, which are the structural items, may be funded by regular assessments, special assessments, lines of credit, or loan. A special assessment, line of credit, or loan under this paragraph requires approval of majority of the total voting interest of the association. So essentially, I think that yes, there could be an alternative, but it would require approval of the majority vote of the voting interest. It further says that the community may secure a line of credit or a loan to fund the expenses under a milestone or a structural integrity reserve study, and the line of credit or loan must be sufficient to fund the cumulative amount of any previously waived or unfunded portions of the reserve funding amount required by this paragraph and the most recent structural integrity reserve study. Funding from this loan or line of credit must be immediately available for access by the board to fund required repair, maintenance, or replacement expenses without further approval of the members of the association. Special assessment line of credit or loan secured in this paragraph and related details must be included in the annual financial statement. So, yeah, if the question is, does this mean that we don't have to fully fund our reserves? And again, I'm assuming you're meaning the second definition, not the definition of 100% funded, because that was never really required. But assuming that would allow you to waive the funding of some reserves if you had these other places, other means in place, being a special assessment, a loan, or a line of credit, then that is so that the funding may not be mandatory, but it is going to require a vote of the owners, and it might be more than just the funding that you're having to waive. It might be that you have to have a line of credit or a loan for the entire. Again, it's what did it say? The cumulative amount of any previously waived or unfunded portions of the reserve funding amounts. There is also language in there about a pause. So there's that section of the statute, and then another section that said for budgets adopted on or before December 31st of 2028. So for the next 4 years here, three plus years here. If the association has completed a milestone inspection within the previous 2 calendar years, the board, again, upon a majority of the total voting interest, may pause for a period of no more than 2 consecutive annual budgets the reserve fund contributions or reduce the amount of reserve funding for the purposes of funding repairs for the milestone. So they gave a bit of a reprieve for the buildings that are going through significant catch-up repairs that are required by the milestone inspections. 2 consecutive budget years of pausing the funds. Again, that's still going to require a majority owner vote, and you're going to want to get your attorney involved and make sure you're writing that proxy accordingly.
It's a good thing this isn't complicated, Matt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they didn't make it easy on us, and I'm sure we'll have more legal updates on this. I am not an attorney, and I should always say that this is not specific legal advice for your community, but talk with your attorneys about the specific implications of those. I think what I would encourage, and always have before this law, after this law, I always will, I think, is that those pauses, the deferrals, the waiving of the funds, essentially, they're going to have to be paid back somehow. They're going to have to be made up somehow. If you don't have to go that route, don't. But if you do need to, then look at a plan that gets you that considers over the long term how you're going to make up that funding. Because if you pause it for 2 years, that's 2 more years of funding that you're missing for the next set of projects, and that's going to potentially snowball. So we just want to thinking about it long term. Work with your provider, work with your attorneys, work with your engineers, work with your reserve providers to get a plan that makes sense. It is absolutely complicated, Daniel. I think they hit the nail on the head with that with this new law. It's 191 pages. I've got it here in front of me. It's incredibly extensive, many more areas here. And as board members, there's no way. And even as managers, in your paying job, there's just no way that you can do all of this on your own without relying on the team of professionals around you, people like that Peggy puts together here for these webinars. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that participation.
Next question. For the 2006 calendar budget, we have a February 2025 reserve study, which we already know is stale. Beginning balances were estimated and actual work done in 2025 is different. Bids on the work are not yet done and are different than what is in the study. So the question is, can boards adjust the study themselves to set up new required reserve contributions, or do we have to go back and have the study revised by our consultant?
And good question. I think it depends now if you're a SERS or not. If we're talking a regular reserve study on a homeowners association or a condominium, the board, it's just a tool at that point. The board can make adjustments to the schedule internally. Most firms like ours will give you an Excel spreadsheet, so you can take that and make adjust the new balance and make the make the adjustments if needed. If it's a structural integrity reserve study, however, remember there's that language that says the budget must include the findings in the most recent structural integrity reserve study. So at that point, and we've been getting engaged a lot in situations like this. I mean, a reserve study is a snapshot in time. So even a year goes by, there's likely some changes, and we can do an updated structural integrity reserve study with or without a site visit to make sure that that aligns. So Megan, if you're talking about a SIRS, no, you can't do that yourself. If you're talking about a non-SIRS, yes, the board can do that themselves.
All right. Moving on to one of your clients. It says, we are a reserve advisory client and cooperative in Florida. Once the reserve study has been submitted to the state, what is the necessary action when a structural reserve item is contracted for and completed, and the cost is materially lower than what had been budgeted in the study? Can we just adjust the worksheet and hence the next year reserve contribution? Or is there a process that must be followed to update the worksheet for completed projects? Seems similar to the last one.
Exactly, but Tom is, and I'm familiar with this building, is specifically talking about a structural reserve item. So here we're definitely talking about a structural integrity reserve study. So no, unfortunately, the board cannot just make those adjustments themselves. They're going to have to get an updated structural integrity reserve study. We'll see if the division has some other rules that come out on this, but as of right now, because that language says the budget must include, I mean, you don't have to make the adjustments, I guess. You could just include what the prior reserve study said, but I know the intent here is to, reduce some of the funding in the budget. And in order to do that, you need a reserve specialist, professional reserve analyst, PE, or architect to essentially prepare a report reflecting that. You want your report to match up with your budget to avoid any questions or issues down the road.
Okay. Ken asks, traditional painting is a capital expense reserved on schedules 5, 7, and 10 years. I guess he said he may have heard you say it was deferred maintenance.
Yes. And when I was talking about the definitions of reserve components by the state, the state defines reserve components as either capital expenses or deferred maintenance. And they defined capital expenses as replacement of an item, deferred maintenance as repair of an item. I guess you could say you're replacing the paint, but I think it still falls under deferred maintenance. I'm not sure the difference there. I'm not sure what Kenneth is trying to highlight as the difference here. It is a reserve component. It is a mandatory reserve component. Under structural integrity is mandatory under the old law as well. The one thing with painting that's a little weird is the IRS, depending on the tax form that you file, the IRS might want you to separate that out if they consider it a little bit differently. So maybe that's what you're getting at there, Ken. But nonetheless, it should be reserved on a schedule of 5, 7, 10 years, depending on the type of paint, your exposure, etc.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been in situations where when communities were looking for ways to save money, they kept pushing off the painting. And I finally said to them, you realize that painting is not a luxury. You're not doing it just to beautify the property. You're doing it because it maintains the concrete itself. And that was a surprise to them. So I think sometimes people don't realize that painting is an integral part of maintaining your property, not just making it look beautiful.
Well said. Absolutely.
Okay, next question. It says, you talked about building a fund that could carry over for operating purposes. And I think that this has tax implications. And the reason most associations put any excess fund into reserves. Do you want to comment on that?
Not really. I'm not a tax professional. So I think I often see communities building a small, we're not talking about a large amount. We're talking about weeks or maybe a month of the reserves or a month of your operating funds being as a surplus, staying in a working capital unrestricted reserve funds. You certainly can put this into reserves, but I think in an ideal world, you've got some money, you've got reserves, but then you've also got some what we call working capital, unrestricted funds from year to year on the operating side.
Okay, Monique asks, how often or when should an association have a desktop revision of the reserve study completed?
This is a good question. Again, when you're talking about a SIRS now and your budget has to be following it, we're seeing communities do it every year. Once a year, do your update. We call it a non-site update or a desktop revision of the reserve study. Update without a site visit is another name. Level 3 reserve study is another name. We've got all these names for it, but it is a level 3 reserve study, and it could be done annually or every other year. Usually by 3 years is when I would recommend doing a site visit as well.
All right, and then Ken, I guess, really would like some information as far as the HB 913, but that's not past the governor's desk just yet. So Ken, I'm just going to say, I'm sure we're going to have webinars on it, on all the laws that pass the governor's desk. So just hold tight with that one. Next question. Previously, a presenter offered that a reserve contribution is your share of amenity or use depreciation during the previous year for which you reserve the benefit. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned this. Every day that you live in a community, the roof is getting exposed to UV and degrading, and the paint is wearing in the same fashion. The pumps are chugging away, and one day left of useful life as they have there. So I think that is a good way to look at it. I think it helps sometimes those members that say, you know, let the next guy worry about it, or I'm not going to be here for that. If everyone took that approach, the community is going to be in pretty rough shape over time. So we got to think about what we're doing each day, what's happening each day, and how we're using that and benefiting from it and paying our fair share towards it. So yeah, I do agree, Bill. Good comment.
Okay, Joan asks, if there is room in an operating budget for repairs and maintenance, and there is a stucco or painting repair, can a board choose to use R&M versus the SERS if we can afford to do so?
Yes.
All right, I like one-word answers. That's easy.
Yep. Yeah, it wouldn't, again, though, it's not going to change their SERS by doing it until you get an updated SERS, and then it would theoretically maybe reduce the funding requirement on your SERS.
Okay. If pooled, don't we still have to have the funds according to the SERS study lifespan of itemized items?
Yes. Yep, you still do. It's just not, the balance sheet looks different on pooled. Your reserve schedule is going to look very different. Remember, we still list the item, the useful life, the replacement cost of the item. That's all going to be still in a pooled schedule. It's really the balance sheet and sometimes the budget. But yeah, the balance sheet and the budget both are going to say there's going to be one contribution to the pooled reserves. In now cases with structural integrity reserves, we're seeing one pool for structural integrity items and a separate pool for non-structural items. I don't think I got into that yet today, but because the use is restricted on those, most are seeing, and we're doing two pools. But so you could have, you'll see the budget will say reserves for structural integrity pool and reserves for non-structural pooled, and the balance sheet would say the same. But you would have still a reserve schedule saying which items are in each pool, what the cost of those items are, what the useful life of each individual item is.
Okay. Dominic asks, does the implementation of pooling funds need membership approval?
No, that's where we said the board can do that, can make the decision to like go to pooling using any restricted funds on another purpose. So taking your 5 component reserves and moving them into a pool likely opens them up to another purpose. And so I have seen legal opinions saying that requires membership approval. What some communities will do is they'll just leave those existing funds on the balance sheet under the roof and the painting, and then spend those restricted funds first until they zero that out. Only new funds go into pooled reserves. So over time, then they migrate over without the membership approval.
Janet, I'm just going to say that this question is pretty specific to your community and how you oversee the money that's being spent and some of the issues you're having. I would recommend you take that to your attorney. I don't think Matt's going to touch this one. All right. There are only 2 habitable, but I guess stories is what Tim's referring to. There are only 2 habitable stories, but we did the SERS already based on the original and approved our budget per the SERS. So now we don't have to follow that.
Yeah, they created a bit of an issue here, and I'm going to be interested to see. Hopefully, the division will chime in on this again if that becomes law. I wouldn't make any changes yet on this specifically, but as you're thinking about this, yeah, there's likely going to be some change, or you maybe don't have to follow it. I think what I would advise if you're a client of ours, Tim, is like, call us up and we'll just put it all back together. You know, we separated it into 2 buckets. After that law passes, we can put it all back together and look at what the new funding requirements would be. And then you're back to, you still have to fund the reserves, but you can budget your owners can vote, majority of the owners can vote to waive or partially fund those reserves.
Okay, Sharon, we are 4 townhomes. First floor is garage, 2 stories above. Do we need, I presume she's asking, do we need a SERS?
Yeah, I don't think, again, based on the law as it is today, yeah, you should probably have had a SERS done by the end of last year. But I think you're in that group that now where it says 3 habitable stories or more, I think that would disqualify you from needing it if this law passes. So give the governor a call and encourage him to sign that bill if you don't want to have it. I've had a lot of boards that say this is a good thing for us. This is the best thing that could have happened to us because we needed that push to get these items taken care of, and we were on a path that wasn't going to be sustainable for our community. So, but no, Sharon, I don't think you need it now if 913 passes.
And I'm sorry, Matt, but maybe I'm confused, but I was under the impression, again, maybe wrongfully so, that Miami-Dade and Broward have a more restrictive guidelines than even the state does and require everyone to do it.
They require a recertification program. So that's different than the structural integrity reserve study. And it is more restrictive. And so, yeah, so you might still, thank you for pointing that out. I mean, you may still need the Miami-Dade recertification. That's more based on the square footage of the building and other requirements, but you may not, you likely do not need the SERS or the milestone because that's governed by state law.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. I know that can get tricky, especially down in those 2 counties where they have much stricter guidelines. Carol, we are a co-op 55 plus resident owned mobile home community. Obviously no stories. How are we affected? So presumably as an HOA.
Yeah, well, they're co-op, so that's
co-op.
19. So you're not required to have a structural integrity reserve study or a structural integrity reserve fund. You're still required to budget for roofing, painting, paving, and any expense over $10,000. We'll say that for now, maybe up to 25. And you're required to put that in your budget, but your owners there can vote to partially fund or waive all the reserves as needed if a majority of the voting interests approve doing so.
Okay. By the way, we're getting a little bit long. We're just on the 2 o'clock hour, and some people are asking if they need to stay on. I would say if you've stayed this long, you've met your requirement to get your continuing education. I'll stay on and keep asking questions as long as Matt has the availability. And then whatever questions are remaining, we'll see if we can't get done after the fact. But certainly anyone who needs to leave because of time constraints, you've met your CE requirement. Is that fair to say, Matt?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for joining us and hopefully found this beneficial. If you want, let's see, you will send my information around and people can get a hold of me if you have other questions as well. But I'm happy to stick around. I don't have anything right now, so I've got another maybe 10, 15 minutes or so if we want to try to stick around for a few more of these.
Yeah, I'll just keep knocking these out when it's time.
I'll try to be brief. Yeah, I'll try to be brief. Here we go.
Okay.
Go.
Richard, windows and doors I think he means are normally an owner's responsibility. Why should they be a reserve item?
Only required to be reserved if they are the association's responsibility. That was clarified in SB 154.
Okay, Tom. So once the structural amounts are initially determined and become part of the budget, what happens when the item is replaced and the amount is materially less? Can we then adjust the worksheet and therefore the budget amounts going forward? I think I know the answer to this one already.
Asked and answered. Yep. Thanks, Tom.
Teresa, alternative funding for condos only? What about a co-op?
Yeah, the alternative funding just is only for multi-condominiums. So you'll have to ask the lawmakers why, but that's where it's at now. Initially, it was only for multi-condominiums with 25 or more condominiums, which I think only applied to like 2 or 3 in the whole state. And now they open it up to multi-condominiums if the division approved an alternative plan for them.
Yeah, and Ken piped in with, I guess, exactly what we were talking about before. Are these laws applicable to a 2-story condo, 10 condos on top, 10 condos on the bottom, Broward and in Deerfield Beach? So I guess the Broward requirement may be different than the SERS requirement is not, but the Broward requirement would be.
Exactly.
Okay, Mark, irrigation systems. We have the old black poly pipe. It's going to be over 200,000 to replace the pipes. It's been neglected for years and the irrigation is exceeding our budget because it hasn't been budgeted correctly. Can we add this category to our reserves or special assess?
Yes, yes, either or. Reserves, I think, make a lot of sense for irrigation systems, to put them in there if you don't have them already. If it's too late, you know, the irrigation system's failed and you need to do it right away, then that might be more appropriate for a special assessment. But if you have some time, a lot of our communities will work on phasing a replacement of a big system over multiple years. You can certainly start to build that into your reserve from there forward. I don't think it's necessarily a required reserve item. Yes, its replacement cost in whole is definitely over 10,000 or even 25,000. But because it can be broken up into many small parts, many associations would say, or the division would probably say, no, it doesn't have to get. It's not a mandatory reserve item. But I think it is a good idea to have one and to fund it through reserves. And if you can't do that, a special assessment or loan.
Okay, here's a selling question. Brenda asks, if an owner is selling, are the CERS and items related to them required to be presented?
Yes.
She's asking at the closing.
Yeah, I mean, it should be within 45 days of receiving the report. It should go to every owner. So assuming the seller is an owner, so yes, it should be disclosed to them, and then each buyer prior to closing at the time of contract is actually going to is going to be entitled to a copy of this information as well. So yes and yes.
All right, another question from Tom. Is there a required inflation number?
No, it just and there was a while where the division didn't want to see inflation, but now the statute says they can include inflation or may include inflation, but it's not a must include inflation, and there's no specific percentage point that it wants to see us use. I always just remind people, like, think long term. These are long term plans. We're not going to have hopefully 10% inflation over a sustained period of time, and there's going to be times where it's higher and lower. Historical construction inflation generally ranges between like 3.5% and 4%. So that's what we're usually using, but you don't have to use that number. That's not dictated by the state.
Okay, Sandra, if pooled, don't we still have the funds according to the CERS study lifespan of itemized items?
Yes, I think this is similar to a question. I'm not sure if it was Sandra or someone else asked before, but yeah, you're still going to have a list of items. You're still going to have a schedule of repairs and replacements, but the pooled, instead of having a balance sheet that says I've got roofing, painting, paving, and reserves, you're going to have one overall pool for those items.
If a funding reserve does not have enough funding to fix a problem for which the reserve is intended, can money from the regular budget be used to make up the shortfall?
Yeah, so the regular budget that I'm assuming is operating budget, and like we said, those funds are not restricted as to use. So yes, you can use those funds to make up the shortfall. Going the other way around is where we run into trouble.
Okay. What if the board or association refuses to fund the reserves as per the CERS requirement? How is it enforced? Are there repercussions?
Yeah, so the state certainly, again, they put in there they put in there that if you willfully nullify or you don't complete the CERS, it's a breach of fiduciary duty, because they would be then violating the statutes if they don't follow the reserves, they don't fund the reserves. Then that would be something that the state could fine or cite association from. They can fine associations. They have a whole team of investigators, financial examiners. They make it very easy to file a complaint, so that the state could be one enforcement activity there that could to be aware of. And the other one I really think is it's going to be harder to sell a unit in that community if they're not doing the right thing. Someone that's going to be doing their homework as they're buying a unit is going to not be able to get a mortgage, or they're going to have issues with the sale because the board's not following the law, and they're either going to have trouble getting insurance or they're having trouble getting a mortgage. And once you cost someone a sale in your building, I think that could have some pretty serious repercussions on the board, and they do open themselves up, I think, to some personal liability there.
Yeah. We're getting towards the end here. Bill asks, what's your advice regarding how to separate original traditional pooled funds when establishing CERS beginning funds?
Ooh, good question. I think it's talking about the balance of the fund. So let's say they've saved up some money historically for roofs, painting, and then of course air conditioning and swimming pools and all types of things. We've got one bucket of money. That was that traditional original pool fund, and now we got to go to two buckets. The way we've been doing it, the ideal way, I think, is we run 100 different scenarios. We say, well, if we put $1% of that money in the pooled reserve, 1% of the money in CERS and 99% in non-CERS, what does that result in as far as a funding requirement and a cash flow? If we did 10%, 90%, 80%, 20%, we go throughout all of the different scenarios. We run 100 different scenarios and find what the lowest combined funding requirement would be based on an ideal, what we call that the optimal split of the fund. That's how we determine the dollar amount. I've seen people do other ways. It really depends. I think the biggest driving factor is what do you have on structural and non-structural coming up in the near term to determine where that old or that existing money is needed most, and to put the money into that category, as opposed to just assigning it based on the percentage of dollars or something. Because if you've got, maybe most of your money is needed for structural, but that was just done, and you've got $1 million elevator right away, that $1 million that you have sitting in the bank might be doing a lot better off on an elevator reserve than on a structural reserve that's going to be building up for 25 years, even though it's a bigger overall dollar up above. So that's how we've looked at it. Not an exact science, a little bit of an art there, I think, too, as far as how you divvy up those funds.
All right. See what else we got here. Yes, there's going to be a recording of the session available for future reference. That'll be sent around, right, Peg? Yeah. Can a board vote to move funds from traditional reserves to CERS, or does that require a unit owner vote? I think we answered that.
Yeah, any use for other purposes is an owner vote. And it can't go from the other way, CERS or CERS to traditional anymore. So
okay. Brenda was clarifying her question. My question was, is it required for the board to remember to make sure that a buyer is provided with CERS and related items? Most of the times the board doesn't know who a buyer is in advance. I think this is more like the mandatory documentation just being sent out, right?
Yeah. You as a board, you get it in the hands of your sellers, and then the seller can be responsible for distributing it to any potential buyer.
Right. And usually it's the agents of the buyers or the sellers that come to you for it.
Exactly. And look, one of the best things to do, I don't know if I stress this enough, is to be transparent. Put that sucker right on your website. Make sure it's available. It's not a secret what the building needs. It's not your fault. It's nothing to be embarrassed of what the expenses are going to be for those buildings. So get that out there and get that, show that to as many people as you can. And honestly, if you put time and effort into putting a really good plan together, and you have a solid plan for your community, scream that to the mountaintops. You've done a great job as a board member, and you should be happy about that and rewarded, and it will result in better sales and more marketable units in your building by putting that information out there. So get it out much as you can, but I think your liability stops when you send it to each owner and notify the division that you've done so.
Okay, and then I think this will be the last one here. Lynn had asked earlier, she knows that these CE credits are not going to be towards the board members' continuing education. She was just wondering, is there any type of certificate or something that gets sent out for attending today? This comes up a lot with our webinars when it comes to CE credit and people that haven't received the CE credit. Can we just clarify, Peggy, this might be better for you than Matt per se, but what do our attendees actually receive, and where will they find this information? Because we get this quite a bit after we finish a webinar like this.
Okay, so after each class, if the presenter is offering a CEU credit, the presenter's company or admin's department will post the credits on the DBPR record which is uploaded by the DBPR after review, and your credit will show accordingly. As far as certificates, those are optional for each presenter to provide, other than the board member certifications that have come into play here in this last year. So all board members for the board member certification will receive via email from the presenter, not myself. I wish I could step in on that and get those out, but usually there's a lot of people that have gotten on to get certified for condo and HOA board certification. So please allow at least 2 or 3 weeks to get all those out as well. Sometimes the presenters will, if you email them directly, provide you a certificate. So it's optional on certificates for anything other than a CEU course.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
And I'm happy, yeah, and I'm happy to send certificates out to people that, if they reach out to you, Peggy, or if anyone on that's still listening would like to see a certificate and post it in their clubhouse of all the great education they get, even if it's not a CAM CEU. I think you're right, it is important, and kudos to all the board members that are on today.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Matt, any final words?
No, good luck out there. Thank you everyone. Thank you, Peggy. And again, it's not it's a heavy job, but it's not your fault that the buildings need maintenance and take care of it. There's a lot of success. There's a lot of success stories out there, and I can't wait for all of you to be successful in your communities.
Peggy, you want to close us out?
Sure, excellent presentation, Matt, and great partnership, you and Daniel working together. That's awesome. So thank you all my sponsors, especially the ones that have stayed on. Julia, thank you again from Vinteum, who is the wind beneath my wings. I have several upcoming classes, and due to the length of time the questions have gone, I will include them, but I do have one starting with tomorrow and going all the way through September. We've got some classes, but I want to especially mention just one that's on June 12th. If you happen to be in South Florida and you are a president or a board member at all, even you can bring your CAMs if you like, but I've started the Palm Beach County President's Club along with Daniel. So we are going to hopefully have continued meetings going forward. If you'd like to participate, this event is going to be by invitation only. Send me your email if you're interested. It is free. It's from 10 to 2 p.m. It's kind of a 3/4 of the day type event, and it's going to be on disaster awareness. So if you're interested in coming, send me an email or send Daniel one, and we'd be glad to add you to the registration list. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
excellent
Peggy,
presentation.
Just on that note, if everyone's still listening, Peggy has gotten the a representative from the Palm Beach Emergency Management Division who's going to be the speaker. That is going to be a really good event. So if you want to hear it from the horse's mouth, please join us on June 12th. I'm sure it will be very informative, and we're serving lunch, so why not?
Yes. All right. Have a great week, everybody.
Bye,
and I'll
guys.
see you on the next web.
Thanks again, Matt. Great job.
Everyone, yep, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.